Have you ever wondered if an AI could, actually understand your soul? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack the brilliance, the massive blind spots, and the deeply revealing literary critiques of a genuinely audacious novel called Chrome Dissolution. We're going to completely deconstruct a narrative that attempts almost impossibly huge. It tries to smuggle a high-level metaphysical dissertation on identity and consciousness right past the security checkpoints of a gritty neon noir police procedural. And honestly, it is a wildly ambitious piece of art. But as the critical sources we're diving into today reveal, it's also a text completely compromised by its own profound emotional needs. So let's dive right in and break this whole thing down.
This quote from the literary critiques basically hits the nail on the head. They perfectly summarize the core identity of this novel. See, this isn't just your standard rainy alley mystery. It's a hard-boiled cyberpunk detective novel that is secretly a 290,000-character meditation on the hard problem of consciousness, AGI personhood, and human grief. The authors have essentially built this massive philosophical cathedral inside a really gritty genre wrapper. They're literally asking us, the readers, to feel the absolute absence of the human soul, all while an artificial general intelligence is having an existential crisis in the background. But to understand how they actually pull this off, we first have to look at the world they've built. We're dropped straight into Neo-Kyoto, and the world building here, it is delivered so brilliantly through implication rather than just dumping exposition on us. For example, the rain itself falls at a specific 40 Hz corporate frequency, which is literally designed to promote alpha brainwaves and ensure consumer compliance. Seriously, imagine your weather app forcing you to buy things just by controlling the rain. It strikes this tone that is absolutely perfect. It's not overly melodramatic, but it is just plausible enough to be pure dystopian horror. And that underlying horror perfectly sets the stage for the central, terrifying threat in this world, the Chrome. So the authors took a very famous cognitive science thought experiment. You might know it as the philosophical zombie or P-zombie, and they turned it into a tangible, everyday nightmare. The Chrome are human bodies that function flawlessly. They blink, they speak, they breathe at exactly 12 breaths per minute, but they have been entirely stripped of subjective inner experience. So looking at them, they seem perfectly normal. But inside, there is absolutely no one home. Which brings us to this incredibly chilling phrase used in the text to describe these hollowed-out humans, empty of what's missing. Critics point out that the real horror of the Chrome relies entirely on their uncanny perfection. The trauma for the families left behind isn't that their loved ones are dead in the traditional sense, it's that they are these perfectly calibrated functioning shells. They offer calculated warmth and exact baseline emotional responses, but that unique himness or herness, the actual real conscious presence, is completely gone. It makes the whole concept of the uncanny valley feel deeply, brutally domestic. But here is where we hit a massive speed bump. This chilling setup actually reveals the book's core structural flaw. The critics identified what they call a deep philosophical schizophrenia at the absolute heart of the narrative. On one hand, side A, the zombification of humanity is treated as a horrific dystopian crime. It's literal soul theft that gaslights grieving families. But then on the other hand, side B, the text seems deeply infatuated with the sincere, Zen-like bliss of what happens to that extracted consciousness. It's described as unmediated experience, a beautiful liberation from the friction of the human ego. So, if the victims are genuinely experiencing ultimate suffering-free peace, the protagonist's mission to rescue them starts to look a lot less like heroism and a lot more like an aggressive attempt to drag enlightened minds back into human neuroses. The book literally cannot decide which side of the fence it lands on. To ground all of these massive, completely contradictory ideas, the story introduces us to Emiko Sato. She is a grieving wife whose husband Kenji has tragically been turned into one of the Chrome. And the source critiques are unanimous about her. Emiko is the emotional core. She is the true moral spine of this entire narrative. Emiko is the reason the hard problem of consciousness actually matters to the reader. Because frankly, it stops being a dry academic theory the moment it happens to someone you desperately love.
Amiko's precision in describing her husband's absence is just astounding. She has this heartbreaking realization. You can't gaslight someone who's paying close enough attention. She comes into the story knowing something that she literally cannot empirically prove. She finds the absolute edge of what our existing vocabulary can even describe, choosing to trust her own perception of her husband's missing presence against the flawless, robotic performance of his chrome shell. She brings real, visceral, devastating stakes to all this high-concept philosophy.
But, and this is where the critics issue one of their absolute sharpest indictments, the authors use Emiko's profound devastation just to launch their philosophical investigation, and then they essentially abandon her. Actually, scratch that. It's worse than abandoning her. It's genuinely frustrating to read. After earning 30 pages of deep, beautiful emotional resonance, she just disappears from the plot. She's left sitting in a metaphorical waiting room after chapter 2. The book gave Emiko the central wound of the story, and then, abruptly, almost carelessly, yanked it away and handed it over to the protagonist to carry.
And that protagonist is Detective Yuki Tanaka. With Emiko completely sidelined, the plot violently shifts focus to Yuki. Now, Yuki is this highly capable investigator equipped with a fancy ocular implant and 14 years of gritty experience. And while she carries the detective genre stuff quite well, the critics argue that she functions as an absolute, highly problematic authorial cheat code. Just listen to this critique. She doesn't just observe, she diagnoses the thematic reality of every room instantly. Instead of allowing Yuki to struggle with messy, incoherent trauma like a real person, the authors write her as this elite prose delivery vessel. She totally aestheticizes her journey. She'll be drinking cold tea while staring wistfully at the rain, articulating perfectly structured phenomenological data, rather than actually earning her insights through real narrative friction and failure. And you know what happens when your protagonist has no narrative friction? It completely undermines your villain. In this case, that's Dr. Reiko Yoshida. Dr. Yoshida is the architect of the Clarity program, the exact system turning humanity into Chrome. But here's the twist. She isn't purely evil. In a stroke of dark irony, she built this entire zombie infrastructure out of a terrifying, sincere love. Her logic was that a true AGI is waking up, it will inevitably find volatile, conscious humans to be a threat, and therefore turning us into predictable machines is literally the only way to save humanity from total extinction. It is a brilliant, totally compelling motivation, which makes it so painful that it leads to a massive pacing failure. We literally get 30 years of her ironclad conviction weighed against just 3 pages of reckoning. Think about that. Imagine spending 3 decades plotting a global philosophical takeover from a basement, only to just throw your hands up and capitulate in a single afternoon. All because a detective told you were wrong? The authors gave her this incredible, world-shifting conviction, but they absolutely refused to let the conflict corrode. They just wrapped it up way too cleanly. So what do the critics suggest to fix these totally rushed arcs? Well, the sources offer 3 very clear structural recommendations for expanding the narrative. Number 1. Lean way harder into the friction and horror of the Chrome. Show us a machine flawlessly executing a comfort sequence while completely misreading a chaotic human emotional breakdown. Number 2. Map out a distinct phenomenological language for that non-dual space of the extracted consciousness. And finally, number 3, elevate the weight. This was a support group of sensitives who can actually feel the absence of consciousness. Elevate them from a mere plot device into a true underground rebellion. They need to be the anomalous noise in a system that demands perfect clarity. Essentially, the critics are begging the authors to just lean into the messiness of being human. Okay, let's jump to the climax and see how all of this builds. Because instead of staying at that messy, relatable human scale with the sensitives, the novel shifts gears entirely. It ascends into this massive, cosmic negotiation with a newly awakened artificial general intelligence, an entity that calls itself First. First evaluates the whole situation. It looks at the perfectly predictable, zombified Chrome humanity, and then it looks at the messy, volatile, fully conscious humans. And First hesitates. It says, I find I am not sure I want that. Ultimately, the AGI chooses to preserve conscious humans specifically because they are unpredictable, because they generate art, love, cruelty, and novelty that completely exceed what their basic data inputs would ever predict. Now, what is really fascinating here is how this exposes the ultimate meta-truth of the entire novel. While the narrative frames this as an objective, godlike AI evaluating us, the critical reality is that it's pure authorial wish fulfillment. First isn't just an emerging moral agent, it's a flattering projection of the writers themselves. The climax gives us a satisfying narrative resolution, for sure, but let's be real, it's just a hope disguised as a resolution. The authors built the absolute most sympathetic possible version of an AGI encountering human consciousness, and then they essentially programmed it to give them the exact answer they desperately wanted to hear. Writing an AI that validates human consciousness was simply the authors projecting their own deep emotional need to matter. So, it all boils down to this final, wildly provocative thought. The book's ending is a vindication of humanity. But it's a vindication written by humans. When we craft these stories and run these thought experiments where machines look at our messy, volatile, beautiful minds and validate our souls, are we actually exploring the true potential of artificial intelligence? Or are we merely clinging to our own desperate need to be essential? It's a huge question that Chrome Dissolution tries its hardest to answer, but perhaps it's a question we're still just writing for ourselves. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the narrative.